Stalingrad, the frozen hell of urban warfare, the frozen inferno. In the summer of 1942, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. After sweeping through Poland, crushing France, and tearing into the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht pushed ever deeper into the east. Adolf Hitler, intoxicated by the dream of Lebensraum, demanded not only territory, but symbols, victories that would echo through history. His gaze fell on a city along the Volga River, Stalingrad. On the surface, it was a key industrial hub producing tanks, weapons, and supplies. But far more than that, it bore the name of his enemy, Joseph Stalin. To take Stalingrad was to strike at the heart of Soviet pride, to humiliate its leader, and to cement Germany's dominance over the East. Yet what awaited the German Sixth Army was not the triumph Hitler envisioned, but a nightmare beyond imagination. For in Stalingrad, the rules of war would change. The city, sprawling with factories, railways, and tenements, became a labyrinth of fire and ruin. And as summer turned to autumn, and autumn bled into the bitter Russian winter, soldiers on both sides found themselves trapped in a frozen inferno, a hell of rubble, snow, and death. The battle began with thunder. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed a bombardment so ferocious it reduced much of the city to rubble. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. Tens of thousands of civilians perished in the firestorms. Streets became fields of ash, buildings skeletons of concrete and steel. To the German High Command, this seemed the first step toward quick victory. But in reality, the destruction played directly into Soviet hands. Every bomb created new hiding places, new killing zones. The ruins became fortresses. The Red Army understood what was at stake. Stalin's infamous Order No. 227 had been issued. Not one step back. Retreat was no longer an option. Men and women, soldiers and civilians alike, were ordered to defend every street, every building, every room. For the defenders, surrender meant death. For the attackers, each step forward came at an unbearable cost. The city itself became the weapon, and both sides were drawn into what the Germans would call the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. By September, the fighting had devolved into savage close-quarters combat. Machine gun nests were hidden in basements, snipers lurked in half-destroyed attics, and trenches crisscrossed living rooms and courtyards. Soldiers fought for staircases, for corridors, for single walls that provided cover. The front lines shifted daily, sometimes hourly, as control of a building passed back and forth multiple times in a single day. The ruins echoed with screams, explosions, and the relentless crack of rifles. Then came the winter. Temperatures plummeted below -30 degrees Celsius. The Volga froze, cutting off Soviet supply lines except for daring night crossings under fire. German soldiers, ill-prepared for the cold, wrapped themselves in rags, shivered in unheated shelters, and watched their rations dwindle. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes before bullets could. Weapons jammed. Vehicles stalled. Yet the fighting never ceased. For both sides, the cold was as deadly as the enemy. Stalingrad became more than a battle. It became a crucible of human endurance. Over 2 million soldiers and civilians would be drawn into its grasp. Hunger gnawed at bellies, frost bit into flesh, and the rubble-strewn streets drank rivers of blood. For the Germans, the dream of quick conquest dissolved into a desperate struggle to survive. For the Soviets, it became a fight not only for a city, but for the survival of their nation. This was not war as Europe had known it before. This was annihilation, fought inch by inch, under the shadow of fire and the weight of snow. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, in that frozen inferno on the banks of the Volga, the fate of World War II began to shift. the city becomes a battlefield. By the autumn of 1942, Stalingrad no longer resembled a functioning city. It had become a vast ruin, a shattered maze of collapsed factories, gutted apartments, and charred streets. What had once been a thriving industrial hub was now a graveyard of steel and rubble, every corner concealing death. And yet, within this wasteland, life and war persisted. The city itself became the battlefield, a living trap that consumed soldiers on both sides. The Germans, accustomed to sweeping victories across open plains with tanks and aircraft, were forced into an environment that nullified their strengths. Panzer divisions found themselves immobilized by narrow streets choked with debris. Artillery and airstrikes, intended to crush resistance, only created more ruins in which defenders could hide. Instead of rapid advances, progress was measured in meters, in staircases, in shattered hallways. The war that had once moved at blitzkrieg speed now slowed to a crawl, each step forward exacting a terrible price. For the Soviet defenders, this transformation was deliberate. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army, implemented a brutal yet effective strategy: fight as close to the enemy as possible. This tactic, known as hugging the Germans, meant that Soviet troops clung to their adversaries at ranges so tight that air and artillery support became impossible. Every street, every wall, every pile of rubble was contested. Germans could not unleash their full firepower without endangering their own men. The city swallowed armies whole, reducing the mighty Wehrmacht to squads fighting room by room. Famous strongpoints emerged from the chaos. The Red October Steel Factory, the Barricadi Ordnance Plant, and the Dzerzhinsky Tractor Factory became fortresses where Soviet defenders clung to life with grim determination. Within these ruins, combat was savage and unrelenting. Soldiers fired across assembly lines, grenades were tossed over conveyor belts, and molten steel lay frozen in the snow like relics of a broken world. The very machinery that once produced the tools of war became cover for those now wielding them. One building, later known as Pavlov's house, became a symbol of this defiance. A small Soviet unit under Sergeant Yakov Pavlov fortified a 4-story apartment block and held it for nearly 2 months against repeated German assaults. Mines, machine guns, and sniper nests turned the building into an impenetrable fortress. Legend has it that defending Pavlov's house cost the Germans more lives than taking Paris. Whether myth or fact, the story embodies the nature of Stalingrad. Ordinary soldiers, trapped in extraordinary circumstances, fighting with unbreakable will. Snipers played a critical role in this urban nightmare. From hidden perches in attics and ruined towers, they turned every street into a killing zone. Perhaps the most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, whose marksmanship during the battle earned him legendary status. Zaitsev claimed over 200 confirmed kills, and his duels with German sharpshooters became the stuff of legend. For the defenders, snipers were not only deadly weapons, but symbols of resistance, proof that even in the ruins, the Soviet spirit could not be extinguished. Life in the city was brutal beyond comprehension. Civilians who had not fled were caught in the crossfire, forced to live in cellars without food or heat. Soviet soldiers crossed the Volga under constant artillery fire, ferried across in fragile boats that often sank before reaching the shore. Supplies were scarce, ammunition was rationed, food reduced to scraps of bread or frozen horse meat. Many defenders carried weapons scavenged from fallen comrades. The line between soldier and survivor blurred. For the Germans, conditions were scarcely better. They entered a city they thought would fall in weeks, only to find themselves trapped in a nightmare of endless resistance. Fatigue gnawed at their strength, as every advance ended in ambushes, counterattacks, and invisible enemies lurking in the ruins. Casualties mounted at a staggering rate. The streets of Stalingrad became a graveyard for entire battalions, their bodies swallowed by the snow and rubble. By October, the city had descended into what survivors described as a meat grinder. Battles were fought in total darkness, illuminated only by muzzle flashes and burning debris. A single building might change hands 5 or 6 times in one day, its floors layered with corpses from both sides. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, rat war, for that is what it felt like. Soldiers crawling through sewers, burrowing through walls, fighting in tunnels, and ruins like predators in a maze. Stalingrad was no longer a city to be conquered. It was a monster, devouring men, machines, and morale. For every position defended, the Soviets paid with sacrifice. And all the while, winter crept closer, sharpening its icy claws. The city had become the battlefield, and within its ruins, the struggle for survival and supremacy raged with no end in sight. Tactics of desperation. By the end of 1942, Stalingrad had swallowed armies whole. What began as a German advance to capture a strategic city had devolved into a savage brawl where neither side could claim control. In this crucible, desperation became strategy, and both Germans and Soviets were forced to abandon conventional warfare in favor of brutal improvisation. For the Germans, accustomed to swift victories driven by blitzkrieg, the city was a nightmare they could not escape. Tanks and armored vehicles were useless among the rubble. Their mobility was negated by collapsed streets and hidden mines. Instead of sweeping maneuvers, German soldiers were reduced to small assault groups armed with grenades, flamethrowers, and submachine guns. These teams advanced building by building, often blasting through walls with explosives rather than exposing themselves in open streets. Yet every step forward was contested. Soviet defenders fought from basements, sewer tunnels, and upper floors, firing from angles that German troops could not predict. The Soviets, under General Chuikov's command, perfected the art of attrition. Chuikov understood that his greatest weapon was not firepower, but proximity. By staying as close to the enemy as possible, Soviet troops denied the Germans the ability to call in airstrikes or artillery without risking their own men. This strategy, known as hugging, turned every encounter into a close-quarters struggle fought with bayonets, pistols, and even shovels. The Soviets welcomed this brutality, knowing that in such conditions, the Germans' technological superiority meant little. Factories became fortresses. The Red October steel factory, the Barricadi ordnance plant, and the tractor factory were transformed into defensive citadels. Inside, Soviet soldiers established sniper nests, machine gun positions, and barricades made from industrial machinery. Conveyor belts became trenches, molten steel hardened into obstacles, and smokestacks provided vantage points for marksmen. German troops who entered these ruins were met with a hail of gunfire, ambushes from hidden corners, and counterattacks launched from subterranean passages. These factories did not merely produce weapons, they consumed soldiers. Both sides relied heavily on artillery, but even here, desperation dictated tactics. Soviet guns on the east bank of the Volga pounded German positions relentlessly, while German mortars rained fire across Soviet strongpoints. The line between friend and foe blurred in the chaos, with shells often landing perilously close to one's own troops. At times, soldiers welcomed the bombardment, not because it destroyed the enemy, but because it masked their movements and allowed them to reposition in the smoke and dust. Snipers intensified the terror of the battlefield. The ruins provided endless hiding places, and every exposed corner could mean death. Vasily Zaitsev, already a rising legend, turned sniping into psychological warfare. His duels with German sharpshooters, including the rumored clash with Major Koenig, became symbols of Soviet resilience. For German troops, the knowledge that unseen eyes were always watching eroded morale. For Soviet fighters, each successful sniper kill was a reminder that even in the city's darkest hours, resistance endured. As resources dwindled, desperation took darker forms. Food was scarce, and soldiers on both sides resorted to eating rats, horses, or frozen scraps scavenged from the ruins. Ammunition was rationed to the point where firefights were sometimes fought with knives, clubs, or improvised weapons. German soldiers suffered from frostbite and disease. Their supplies stretched thin by extended lines and relentless Soviet pressure. Soviet troops fared little better, enduring hunger and exhaustion, but they held one advantage: the Volga. Under constant fire, barges and ferries still crossed the river at night, bringing reinforcements and supplies. For the Germans, cut off from resupply and relief, the city grew colder and more hostile with every passing week. Perhaps the most desperate tactic of all was the psychological war waged by both sides. Germans broadcast propaganda urging Soviet troops to surrender, while Soviet loudspeakers blasted patriotic songs and messages of defiance into the night. In some sectors, voices echoed across no man's land, promises of food, threats of annihilation, or taunts meant to break enemy spirits. Yet instead of capitulation, this only deepened the resolve of men trapped in the city's grasp. The longer the battle dragged on, the clearer it became that neither side could sustain the slaughter indefinitely. The Germans bled manpower and morale with every block they seized. The Soviets sacrificed thousands to hold positions that seemed indefensible, but they clung on regardless. Stalingrad had become less about strategy and more about survival, a contest of endurance where the side willing to embrace desperation most fully would outlast the other. By November, the situation had reached its breaking point. The Germans, stretched thin and battered by unending resistance, did not realize that the Soviets were preparing something far greater than simple defense. Beyond the ruins, far to the north and south of the city, massive Soviet forces were assembling. While the Germans clawed for control of factories and houses, a storm was gathering, one that would turn their desperation into disaster. The human cost of Stalingrad War has always demanded sacrifice, but at Stalingrad, the human cost reached a level almost beyond comprehension. The city was not merely a battlefield. It became a mass grave, a place where hunger, cold, and exhaustion killed as mercilessly as bullets. By the winter of 1942 to 1943, both armies were locked in a struggle that devoured men by the thousands each day, leaving behind only ruins and silence punctuated by screams. For the Soviet defenders, life was a daily confrontation with death. Soldiers crossed the Volga under artillery fire, ferried in fragile boats that shattered on icy waves. Many never reached the western bank, slipping into the freezing river and vanishing beneath the black water. Those who survived often carried only a rifle, or sometimes only a handful of bullets. There were not enough weapons for every man. It became common for one soldier to carry ammunition while another carried the rifle. The weapon passed along when its wielder inevitably fell. Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, "Not one step back," hung over them like a sentence, ensuring that retreat meant execution by their own comrades. The choice was simple: fight or die. Food was scarce to the point of starvation. Soldiers and civilians alike scavenged for anything edible: frozen potatoes buried beneath rubble, stray animals unlucky enough to be caught. even boiled leather stripped from belts and boots. Bread rations shrank to crumbs, sometimes cut with sawdust to stretch the supply. The hunger gnawed constantly, weakening bodies already ravaged by cold. Malnutrition turned strong men into husks, yet they continued to fight, driven by desperation and discipline. The cold itself became a predator. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius and lower, seeping into bones and freezing exposed skin within minutes. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes, forcing amputations that were often performed without anesthesia. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, old curtains, or scavenged cloth in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. Fires were rare, too dangerous, too visible. Nights were spent huddled in cellars, breath crystallizing in the air, bodies shaking uncontrollably. For many, sleep meant death, as exhaustion carried them into unconsciousness from which they never awoke. Civilians trapped in the city bore an equally terrible burden. Tens of thousands had been unable to evacuate before the German assault. They lived in basements and sewers, their lives reduced to survival in darkness. Children starved. Families froze together in cellars, their bodies later discovered entwined, locked in a final embrace. Mothers scavenged among corpses for clothing to keep their children warm. Civilians who ventured into the open for food or water risked death from snipers, shells, or the bitter cold. The line between soldier and civilian blurred, both sharing the same torment in the ruins. The Germans, too, paid dearly. Though better equipped initially, they were not prepared for the Russian winter or for the protracted nature of the fight. Supplies dwindled as the battle dragged on, and the Luftwaffe, once feared as the instrument of rapid conquest, proved incapable of sustaining an entire army by air. Rations shrank until German soldiers boiled horsemeat or scavenged what little could be found in the ruins. Like their Soviet enemies, they burned with hunger and shivered in the same unforgiving cold. Medical facilities on both sides collapsed under the strain. Wounded soldiers lay untreated for days, their screams echoing in bunkers until death silenced them. Surgeons operated in freezing conditions with little more than vodka as disinfectant and crude tools for surgery. Blood froze before it could be wiped away. Amputated limbs piled high outside makeshift hospitals, grim monuments to the brutality of the battle. The psychological toll was equally devastating. Soldiers lived in constant fear, not only of enemy fire, but of the collapse of their own sanity. The endless shelling, the claustrophobic fighting, the sight of comrades torn apart daily, it eroded the mind. Some soldiers broke entirely, wandering the ruins in shock, no longer able to comprehend orders. Others became hardened to inhumanity, stepping over corpses as though they were nothing more than obstacles. Mercy vanished. Prisoners were often executed on the spot, as neither side had the resources to care for captives. The statistics only hint at the scale of the suffering. By the end of the battle, over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians combined, had been killed, wounded, or captured. Streets were layered with bodies frozen into the snow, stacked in rubble like grotesque barricades. Dogs gnawed at the dead when hunger drove them mad. The city reeked of smoke, decay, and blood, a smell survivors said never left their memories. Yet amid this horror, resilience persisted. Soviet soldiers clung to their positions, refusing to yield even as their ranks thinned. German troops continued to fight despite starvation and encirclement. Civilians endured in basements, whispering lullabies to children in the dark. Stalingrad had become a vision of hell, but within it, the endurance of human beings, both their capacity for suffering and their will to survive, was laid bare in its rawest form. The human cost of Stalingrad was staggering, but it was not in vain. For behind the suffering, beyond the agony, a turning point was emerging. As the bodies piled high and the city bled, the seeds of German defeat were already being sown. Soon, desperation would give way to collapse, and the frozen hell would claim its ultimate victim, the pride of the German Sixth Army. Turning the tide. By November 1942, the battle for Stalingrad had raged for months. The Germans believed they were close to breaking Soviet resistance. The Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, controlled most of the city's ruins, pressing the Red Army back to narrow strips of territory along the Volga. To Hitler, the fall of Stalingrad seemed imminent, a symbol of German dominance and a final humiliation for Stalin. But beneath the chaos, the Soviets were preparing a blow that would change the course of the entire war. The operation was codenamed Uranus. Conceived by Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, it was a masterstroke of deception and patience, while German forces focused on grinding their way through the rubble of Stalingrad. Soviet high command gathered vast reserves north and south of the city. These were not poorly equipped militia, but fresh, battle-hardened troops supported by tanks, artillery, and cavalry divisions. The plan was bold: encircle the German Sixth Army, cutting them off from all supply and retreat, and strangle them inside the frozen city they had nearly conquered. The key lay in the German flanks, stretched thin and defended not by elite Wehrmacht units, but by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian forces. These positions were vulnerable. Poorly supplied, ill-prepared for the Russian winter, and lacking anti-tank weapons, these troops were no match for the Soviet assault that was about to be unleashed. The Germans had underestimated their allies' weakness and overestimated their own invincibility. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive erupted. At dawn, under cover of snow and fog, thousands of guns roared to life. Artillery barrages thundered across the frozen steppes, shaking the earth and tearing holes in the enemy lines. Tanks surged forward, infantry following close behind. Against this tide, the Axis defenders crumbled. Romanian divisions collapsed in hours, overwhelmed by superior Soviet armor. Within days, the Soviet armies advancing from the north and south linked up near the town of Kalach, encircling over 300,000 German and Axis troops. The hunters had become the hunted. For the first time in the war, a German army had not only been stopped, it had been trapped. The mighty Sixth Army, once the spearhead of Hitler's eastern ambitions, was now surrounded in a tightening noose. Supplies, reinforcements, and escape routes vanished overnight. What had begun as an offensive to seize Stalingrad had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival inside it. Hitler, enraged by the encirclement, refused to allow Paulus to attempt a breakout. He declared that the Sixth Army would stand its ground, promising that the Luftwaffe would resupply the trapped soldiers by air. Hermann Göring boasted that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies per day. In reality, the Luftwaffe barely managed a fraction of that, often less than 100 tons, and even those flights were subject to Soviet interception and the brutal Russian winter. Ammunition dwindled, food ran out, fuel disappeared. Soldiers starved and froze while waiting for relief that never came. The Soviets, relentless in their pursuit, tightened the ring. Each day, artillery shells rained down on German positions. Soviet troops advanced street by street, factory by factory, reclaiming the ruins with steady determination. The Germans fought stubbornly, but the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The once proud Wehrmacht was reduced to scavenging for food, burning furniture to stay warm, and burying their dead in shallow snow pits. The psychological impact was devastating. For the first time, German soldiers began to grasp the reality that their army was not invincible. Letters from the front, intercepted and preserved, reveal despair, hunger, and a dawning sense of betrayal. Many cursed their leaders for abandoning them in the frozen trap. Yet Hitler remained adamant. Stalingrad must be held at all costs, even as the Sixth Army withered. As December turned to January, the ring closed tighter. A desperate German relief attempt, Operation Winter Storm, attempted to break through to Paulus's forces, but it failed against Soviet defenses. Paulus, forbidden to attempt a breakout, could do nothing but watch as his men died around him. By then, tens of thousands had already perished from hunger, cold, and wounds. The once mighty Sixth Army was disintegrating before his eyes. The tide had turned. What was once Hitler's ambition to seize a city had become his greatest catastrophe. The Soviet counteroffensive at Stalingrad was more than a victory of arms. It was a demonstration of resilience, strategy, and the capacity to endure unimaginable suffering. The frozen hell that had consumed so many lives was now closing in on the German invaders themselves, and their destruction was only a matter of time. The fall of the Sixth Army. By the beginning of January 1943, the fate of the German Sixth Army was sealed. Trapped inside the ruins of Stalingrad, encircled by overwhelming Soviet forces, and abandoned by the very leadership that had promised victory, General Friedrich Paulus and his men faced the slow collapse of body, spirit, and hope. What had begun as Hitler's grand push to seize the Volga had become the greatest disaster in German military history. The conditions within the pocket were unimaginable, with no steady supply from the Luftwaffe and temperatures plummeting below -30 degrees Celsius. Starvation and disease spread like wildfire. Soldiers boiled horsemeat, gnawed on frozen scraps of bread, or consumed soups made from wallpaper paste and sawdust. Ammunition ran low, forcing troops to ration bullets as carefully as food. Medical supplies were exhausted. The wounded lay in cellars, groaning in agony, untreated until death silenced them. Frostbite blackened hands and feet, while lice and dysentery sapped what little strength remained. Still, Hitler demanded that Paulus stand firm. In his mind, surrender was unthinkable. Stalingrad was not just a city, it was a symbol, and he believed that holding it to the last man would demonstrate German resolve. To Paulus, the order was both a death sentence and a moral torment. His men were dying in droves, yet Berlin insisted on victory or death. Hitler even promoted him to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, reminding him that no German Field Marshal had ever been taken alive. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to either fight to the last bullet or take his own life. But Paulus, worn down by exhaustion and the unbearable suffering of his army, refused to follow that path. On January 31st, he surrendered his headquarters in the basement of the Univermag department store. The once proud commander of the Sixth Army was now a prisoner, captured with tens of thousands of his surviving soldiers. 2 days later, the northern pocket of resistance collapsed as well, and the Battle of Stalingrad came to its brutal end. For the Germans, the statistics were staggering. Of the nearly 300,000 soldiers encircled, only about 91,000 were taken prisoner. The rest, over 150,000, had already perished in the fighting from starvation, disease, or cold. Of those who surrendered, only around 5,000 would ever return to Germany after years of captivity in Soviet camps. The Sixth Army, once the spearhead of the German advance, had been annihilated. The Soviets, too, had paid a terrible price. Estimates suggest that over 1 million Red Army soldiers were killed or wounded in the battle, alongside hundreds of thousands of civilians who never escaped the city. Stalingrad was a victory carved from sacrifice, bought with blood and endurance. Yet despite the staggering cost, it marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been decisively defeated on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility was shattered, and the Red Army began its relentless push westward that would eventually carry it to Berlin. The psychological impact reverberated far beyond the battlefield. In Germany, news of the defeat shocked a population that had been fed endless propaganda about inevitable victory. The fall of Stalingrad was not only a military catastrophe, but also a moral blow, planting the first seeds of doubt in the German people. In the Soviet Union, it was celebrated as a triumph of resilience, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the Red Army could hold and strike back. The city itself was unrecognizable. Entire districts were reduced to ashes, factories shattered into twisted steel, and neighborhoods buried under rubble and snow. Corpses littered the streets, frozen in grotesque poses, a grim reminder of the scale of the slaughter. Survivors spoke of the silence that followed the battle, a silence broken only by the howling wind sweeping through ruins where once hundreds of thousands had fought and died. For Hitler, Stalingrad was a humiliation he never recovered from. His refusal to allow Paulus to retreat or surrender earlier had condemned the Sixth Army to destruction, and the aura of his strategic genius was permanently tarnished. For Stalin, the victory was a symbol of Soviet endurance and defiance, a propaganda weapon as powerful as any gun. For the world, Stalingrad became the defining moment of World War II, the frozen hell where Nazi ambition met its grave. The fall of the Sixth Army was not merely the end of a battle, it was the turning of the tide in the Second World War. From the ashes of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union would rise stronger, fueled by the memory of sacrifice and the certainty that even the most powerful enemy could be broken. And for the men who fought and died in that frozen city, their legacy would forever echo as a warning of the true cost of war, when human lives are thrown into the furnace of ambition and left to burn in the cold. Legacy of Stalingrad. The guns finally fell silent in February 1943, but the echoes of Stalingrad would reverberate across the world for generations. What had begun as a symbol of Hitler's ambition became the site of his greatest defeat. The ruins of the city bore witness to a truth etched in blood and ice, that even the mightiest armies can be broken, not only by firepower, but by endurance, sacrifice, and the relentless grip of nature itself. For the Soviets, Stalingrad became a legend, a cornerstone of national pride. The victory was framed not merely as a military triumph, but as a testament to the resilience of the Soviet people. Propaganda celebrated the city as the place where fascism was halted and turned back. Streets were renamed, medals struck, and heroes immortalized. To the Red Army, Stalingrad proved that no matter how deep the German advance penetrated, the Soviet Union would endure, adapt, and ultimately overcome. For Germany, the battle was a shattering blow. The loss of the Sixth Army, once a symbol of Wehrmacht invincibility, exposed the vulnerability of Hitler's strategy and the folly of his obsession. The German people, accustomed to news of victories, were forced to confront the grim reality of war. Confidence in Hitler's leadership was shaken, and though the regime's grip remained firm, the aura of inevitability surrounding Nazi conquest had been broken. Stalingrad was not just a military defeat, it was a fracture in the myth of Nazi destiny. Beyond its immediate impact, Stalingrad reshaped the course of the Second World War. From this moment forward, the strategic initiative shifted irreversibly to the Soviet Union. The Red Army, bloodied but emboldened, began a relentless advance westward. Step by step, they pushed the Germans back across the steppes, through Ukraine, Belarus, and Poland, until finally planting their banners in Berlin in 1945. Stalingrad was the turning point, the place where the tide of history changed direction. Yet, the legacy of Stalingrad is not measured only in strategy and geopolitics. It is measured in human suffering. Over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike, were killed, wounded, or captured in the battle. The city itself was reduced to ashes, its population decimated, its buildings reduced to rubble. Survivors carried scars not only on their bodies, but in their memories. For many, Stalingrad was not just a battle. It was the embodiment of war's cruelty, a reminder that human life is the first casualty of ambition unchecked. The ruins of Stalingrad became a symbol of resilience and rebirth. After the war, the city was rebuilt, rising from the ashes as Volgograd, but the memory of what transpired there never faded. Monuments stand where soldiers once bled, and eternal flames burn for the millions who perished. To walk its streets today is to feel the weight of history, to sense the ghosts of a generation who gave everything in the frozen inferno. For soldiers, historians, and ordinary people alike, Stalingrad endures as a warning and a lesson. It shows the limits of human endurance, the extremes of suffering that war can impose, and the capacity of people to resist even when all seems lost. It teaches that wars are not won only by weapons, but by willpower, by sacrifice, and by the determination of ordinary men and women who refuse to yield. And so, the legacy of Stalingrad is twofold. It is the story of a city that stood against annihilation, and of an army that collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. It is a reminder that war, for all its strategies and speeches, is ultimately about human lives. Lives shattered, sacrificed, and remembered. As the final chapter of Stalingrad closes, the lesson remains stark. Cities may be destroyed, armies may vanish, but the memory of their struggle endures. The frozen hell of Stalingrad is not just history. It is a mirror held up to humanity, reflecting both its capacity for endurance and its vulnerability to destruction. And as you step away from this story, remember, the ruins of Stalingrad whisper still. They speak of courage and cruelty, of ambition and downfall, of lives lost in the snow. They remind us that in war, there are no true victors, only survivors, and the lessons carved from their suffering.